That involved medical records, physical medical records being left in a roll cage outside a business in the rain. And you would think that no one's going to behave that way, but businesses do.
Hey, Matt from Kyle Guard. I'd love to welcome Steve from Glaziers to today's podcast. Steve, if you'd like to introduce ourselves to the audience, it'd be great.
Yeah, let's do. Thanks for having me, Matt. My name is Steve Kuncewicz. I'm a partner at Glaziers, which is a law firm in Manchester, part of the ETL Group, which is a multinational professional services business. I lead our creative digital and marketing team, and I'm also our firm's data protection officer.
Interesting combination of roles as well. How did that come about, if you don't mind sharing it?
Oh yeah, no one else wanted to do it. I've spent years dealing with data protection, compliance, and latterly a lot of litigation as well. So it was, I think we're glad to have a specialist in the firm. We've always done pretty well actually at compliance, and we've always taken it pretty seriously. But to be able to say there's a techie in the corner that we can throw these things at, I would imagine is at least some relief to them.
And do you feel that, I guess, creativity and data protection don't always sit as sort of a combined role in organizations? Is that a new way of looking at the delivery of it in an organization?
I think there's plenty of room for creativity. I think there's plenty of room for creativity in any number of regulated spaces, and there certainly is around data protection. But equally, if you're going to do stuff with data, I think there's more pressure now, rightly so, to explain why you're doing it, and to be able to explain why you're doing it to the people that whose personal data you're processing. So I don't think, and no lawyer would say this, compliance is never the enemy of creativity, in my view.
Excellent. So, I guess hot topics. We'll crack through a few of those today. But what would you say, just sort of generally speaking, is the sort of stay awake at night issue, on your mind in terms of cybersecurity for firms?
Human error. Absolutely human error. I've seen a lot of work done in law firms to get their tech stack secure, to get themselves cyber essentials, so on and so forth. But I think we both know, the majority of breaches are either insider jobs or human error. And even the most straightforward stuff, we are now over the weekend, we're now 7 years on from the introduction of the GDPR, or the GDPR coming to force in the UK. And I do think there is a little bit of compliance fatigue. There is understanding from firms that they need to do something. There's an understanding that they need to get insurance cover, I think, although I don't know whether or not that market is starting to harden the way people expect it to. But ultimately, it is human error. It's misaddressed email. It's logging onto the wrong kind of website. It's obvious phishing scams. All of a sudden there's a lot of people being asked to buy iTunes vouchers for no real reason. That to me, that's what really keeps me up at night.
What, in your opinion, can firms do? Because I totally agree with you. Fatigue is becoming an increasing problem. For 20 years in utilities and data centers, we could design the most robust, most high availability configuration. We couldn't overcome the fact that the majority of failures were caused by human error in process. The same is going on in cybersecurity right now. And the sophistication of attacks, we know, is very, very high. Some user awareness levels aren't where they need to be at this moment in time. But again, that's a reflection of some fatigue and some people either not having enough time or having enough understanding of the gravity of the problem that's taking place. What, in your opinion, could smaller firms be doing more of to improve, that reduction of risk from human error?
I think law firms in particular are in a pretty interesting position in that we're very heavily regulated, and we take those regulations very seriously. We have to, and we should do, because they're meant to deliver the right kind of outcomes to individuals. I think moving data protection into the same level of priority as having to comply with the code practice is incredible. Would be incredibly welcome. That's not the same for everybody, and again, that's why I draw the distinction between regulated and unregulated businesses. Many smaller businesses will just be struggling to cope, and will have spent the last probably 8 years, because there was a good year before GDPR came into force, being told that they are going to get breached. It is going to cost them $3 billion. They're going to end up in a dark site somewhere around the world. And I think to a lot of them, compliance is seen as an unattainable standard when actually it's relatively straightforward. Get your policies in place, get your procedures in place, get your staff awareness training done, have the right support around you, and then test it. Test it every 6 months, test it regularly, and more importantly, be willing to admit when there is a problem. Because I think compliance seems so far away that there's a worry that it just can't be fixed when something goes wrong, and it absolutely can. Normally by very talented people in the business, but increasingly by outside professional services providers and by insurers as well.
Do you feel that we've just talked about the sort of compliance aspect of this, and obviously DORA has been very topical for legal and financial services firms, as obviously a lot of money is transacted via those two, sort of verticals. Do you feel that for smaller firms, there's still a gap in terms of their understanding of compliance, whether they're Cyber Essentials or ISO 27001? What can organisations do to improve that sort of outlook that they have?
Treat it like health and safety. Because it is. Again, if you don't have the skill set, get somebody in, whether that be a lawyer, whether that be a GDPR consultant, whether that be an IT provider who specialises in this kind of thing. You don't need to hire the most expensive cybersecurity provider in the world, but just hire in skills that you don't have. Data protection has the need for an accident book in terms of breach register, the same way as you would normal health and safety. So it is just a cost of doing business. I think the problem we had for a long time was that the old legislation pre-GDPR was seen as kind of something we aspire to. We'll get privacy right one day. Well, we'll take privacy seriously one day. And then all of a sudden they're told, right, you are now in deep trouble. And everyone is still, amidst a pretty turbulent economic and regulatory backdrop, still struggling to catch up. Unfortunately, the ICO's view, I think, is very much that you've had long enough to get your act together. And that's the collision at the moment in between the kind of the blind fear of the small firm and what I think many would see as the pretty reasonable expectation, to use a terrible pun, of the regulator.
So we've seen an increasing number of data breaches and some from large public sector organisations.
Legal aid, very recently.
Legal aid, the electoral register, and so on. So there is more information that's out there, and there's definitely a level of, I think, complacency that we see. Not necessarily picking on the size of firms, but the real eye-opener for us is when we actually do implement data sensitivity labeling and an understanding of insider risk inside these firms when we put the technologies in, and the perception of what they thought was taking place in the business before and what they can now see is significantly different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when we're saying insider risk, I mean, there's the Morrison's case from years ago where someone within a business was kind of set out to ruin it. That's, I think, still relatively few and far between. But if we're talking about insider risk through the lens of connecting mobile devices to a network without a BYOD policy, without a data protection policy in place, that's huge. The ease of home working and remote working taking precedence over keeping your data in the right place is obviously a problem, is going to be a problem. But I think the term insider risk actually is quite a helpful one because it tells you there's a problem. It tells you there is something you should be concerned about. But it's not the kind of scaremongering that a lot of firms would have got when GDPR first came in.
In your experience, recent and otherwise, what aspects do firms, I guess from an insider risk point of view, really need to consider more seriously right now?
Social engineering is huge, more so in the professions where we are expected to be not terminally online, but online, because that's how you're meant to build your personal brand and get yourself business. The fact that you see lots of law firms, for example, and lots of professional services businesses where account staff are not allowed to have a public profile because they know that they'll be socially engineered should tell you that that's a massive risk. But a lot of the breaches I've seen when acting with clients, again, are relatively straightforward. You've had a link from what might be another business who you normally transact with, and they're sending you a file they wouldn't normally send you and nobody ever checks. That's massive. We recently seen a little bit of a space of letters of claim of threats over use of music and video online, and when you drill down into them, they're from a Gmail address, but they're made to look like international law firms. And a lot of that shouldn't pass your certain kind of detector. I'm not going to swear on here, even though I'm going to try my best to be as little vanilla as possible. I can swear, sweet. No, I'm not. My mum might watch this. She won't, but I can pretend. And it's easy to say stop and think, well, you know, to look out for these things. But in the same way as you open up your iPhone every day and you've won a £5,000 Walmart voucher, you know, this is stuff you should be used to now. It's enough in the public consciousness so that you should at least stop and think. But it's awareness. Awareness training for me is the absolute best thing that businesses can be doing, apart from getting the basics right.
How do organizations help, in your opinion? And I guess they can put the basics in, they can do all the hygiene factors, you can try to create awareness. And we were talking on a different podcast about actually making awareness more real. Right?
Yeah.
Engaging people. You know, these are the types of attacks that are evolving, right? Here's your table stakes and your hygiene factors on your email. Does it pass this test or that test? From a basic principle, were you expecting it? Right. Next level is actually, this is more sophisticated than that. And this is a longer term social engineering for finance teams, totally. But they're also very focused on IT admins, people with elevated privileges. They know within an environment, if they can get to them and influence them in some way, they will try to. Right now, what do you think firms need to be thinking about or supporting, you know, users inside from a legal point of view to help understand and protect?
Tell them stories about what has already happened. There are loads and loads and loads of examples where what starts out as something fairly innocent turns into anything but. Give them an idea of the fact that you may not think you're a target, but it's probably, I know it's a cliche, it's when rather than if. Especially, again, from the law firm's perspective, we hold huge amounts of very, very sensitive information that's protected by a duty of confidentiality in any event. We are targets, but anybody could be. If you're seen as an easy way to get into them, you've got to have something that is worth something to somebody else. And as much as hacks take up an awful lot of the bandwidth, and they rightfully should do, especially for bigger businesses, again, just explaining to them, I do a lot of training around data protection litigation, explaining some of the facts of these cases, many of which involve, again, misaddressed email and then claims off the back of it, being sent the wrong documentation. Interestingly, there was a case involving a council worker that was looking up, I think, either a current boyfriend or their friend's other partner, telling stories like that, and then people reacting to it in the way that you would hope they would, that this is just never going to be acceptable rather, I think is really important, because then they see that it does happen to you. When you think of the first GDPR fine being against a business called Doorstep Dispensary that's been subject to appeal and dispute for quite some time since it first came through, you know, that involved medical records, physical medical records being left in a roll cage outside a business in the rain. And you would think that no one's going to behave that way, but businesses do. And people do. And again, there just needs to be this understanding that this is happening. It will have happened to you in your personal life. And when you talk about social engineering, you will have clicked on an advert on Facebook that is too good to be true. And that to me is a really good way in. It happens every single day. You are being bombarded with information and an understanding, a sense of what is useful and what isn't out to get you is going to be one of the most important things we can develop.
What, in your opinion, are you seeing a lot of right now, which is basic hygiene factors businesses should think about in terms of that data compliance?
To me, at the minute, because there is an industry and your people have the right to bring claims, that's entirely right. Basic stuff like misaddressed emails. It happens all the time to everyone, including, I would imagine, to the people who are meant to be raising awareness. You know, there's that feeling in the pit of your stomach. You know it's gone on. But again, there has been litigation about that kind of thing that's gone on over the course of a few years. Just stopping and thinking before you press send, stopping and thinking before you click on a link. If it were up to me, you'd have something on everybody's desk that says, you know, stop before you do this, just to engender that moment of pause. I think we could do the moment of pause in any number of areas of our life at the minute. But certainly when we are transferring information potentially around the world, is it going to the right place? That's as basic to me and really relatable way into the conversation. Because and there are plenty of solutions we know about that will make that easier, that will stop that happening. Again, invest in stuff like that. Going at the easy wins, I think, is a really good place to start. And I think if you could then, as a smaller business, see how fewer of these incidents happen over time, it's really measurable as well.
Mm. And there is definitely, we see it, that there is very little measure of that taking place. So the quantum of it in most businesses isn't understood. We've had a lot of healthy discussion about, is there an over-reliance on email in sharing data? Obviously, it's the primary form of communication for most organizations. Do you see organizations reducing risk using like a secure file transfer technology that's separate from email, or?
Depends on what they use. Right. I think it's easy to look at existing systems and say, yeah, well, we can share files through that and think that that's going to be secure enough. Investing in that kind of thing, again, is always going to be useful for a number of different reasons. But I think, as you rightly say, measuring compliance, certainly over time, is actually a little bit difficult, because you know that you have a data protection team there, and unless they can say, it's easy for them to say 2 years down the line, well, you haven't had any hacks. Or that might be nothing to do with them. You might have a really engaged workforce that understands privacy and data protection concerns. So unless you can say, unless you've had an incident, say, and they've led you out the other side of it, and you can say, this has saved us X, sometimes it can seem like a more thankless task than it otherwise needs to be. But, that, again, having that say in, or at least having a voice in the discussion around the C-suite as well, and them understanding what your role is vitally important for any team that's dealing with this kind of thing.
So we're back to your accident book and the fact that actually near misses and potential failures have bigger learning points for most organizations, particularly smaller ones where you've got employees with multifunctional roles. And they have to cover, you have a job in any organization to cover somebody who's on, a long-term sick replacement, maternity, paternity, but actually it's exacerbated in smaller organizations where there's just fewer people to focus on.
Definitely. I mean, there are plenty of insurers who offer cyber protection. Hiscox have always had a pretty good ad campaign about that kind of thing. The idea that you are the head of compliance and head of HR and the MD, or you've sent an email and now you don't know where it's gone. And it's true. Putting it into that kind of context, it's a risky world out there. But increasingly, cyber risk is moving up, not just the risk register of massive companies, it's moving up the risk register of smaller companies. It is one of many things they have to get to grips with, but also it's one of the biggest areas of weakness, and tech is only enabling that, and human behavior is only enabling that, unfortunately.
So what we have started to see much more conditions coming into cyber insurance policies, for small firms, particularly around compliance, around measurement.
Yeah.
Are there some key measurements you would encourage smaller organizations that perhaps aren't thinking about measuring data compliance right now that they should be thinking about doing to help accelerate their position?
I'd have thought that you can only really have meaningful measurement once you have a meaningful approach to compliance, and once you've done the bare minimum in terms of what is expected of you. The assumption that you can achieve compliance and then move on is a very dangerous one, but it's a very common one. How many emails has anybody seen saying we can make you 100% data protection compliant? This does not exist. So it's always going to be a little bit of a movable feast, but the basics are there. You don't necessarily have to go to a lawyer to get them, although we'd be delighted if you came to Glaciers to talk about it. There are people who can help you with this. Buy it in, get the policies and procedures right, and don't just stick them in an employee handbook and never look at them ever again. Think, legitimate interest assessments. People very rarely do them, and it may well be that becomes even more acute now that direct marketing is probably going to be recognised as a legitimate interest sort of carved out by itself in the new legislation that's going through. It takes time and it takes effort. But again, you have policies for other things. Are you scared to do this? Because once you start looking around, you're not going to like what you find. Start with an audit, do it properly, do it from the ground up, and then build a compliance architecture around it. And that compliance architecture might be only so many documents and so much training. It is in no way inachievable for businesses of most sizes.
So what we see is as you've rightly articulated, lots of organizations will go for a security standard, whatever it is. And, the principles of most of them are at the core, very similar, as we know. But then, there's a cycle of audit and a cycle of renewal, yet the threat is constantly evolving. And there isn't a deep enough metric or understanding of what data is within the organization and how that data moves, and particularly how they're obviously interacting with third parties, supply chains, individuals, customers of different types. Where do you think organizations make the biggest effective change right now, rather than focusing on a security standard or a framework per se, in terms of improving their compliance, their data compliance?
Well, first admitting that it is something that they need to do, that they need to prioritize. I think also addressing the fact that we're not just talking about personal data. We could be talking about exfiltrated business or financial data. Moving away from the idea that data is the new oil, data is the new banana skin. I know that sounds glib, but it's absolutely true. It's, again, measurement and compliance are difficult if you've never done it before. And I think that's the big challenge to me, is just start and do something, knowing that you will want to get to the right place eventually. And a commitment to getting to that right place eventually, I think, is the most important point. A lot of it is about attitude and approach, and moving away from this. It can't happen here, in the words of Sinclair Lewis.
So I was involved in a super healthy debate around deepfakes and data authentication challenges. Last week, there wasn't a definitive conclusion, quelle surprise, but what we were trying to get an understanding to the audience was, this is the next thing that we now need to be focused on. So sorry to talk about fatigue yet again, and the accident book comes out yet again and extends, but we do need to think about that, because there are very few ways in which we can help individuals understand, is it genuine, isn't it genuine, in a world that is evolving so quickly and these tools are so freely and available and easy to use. What's a lawyer's perspective on that threat?
It's going to be an interesting few years. I mean, deepfakes in particular, the challenge of, I don't want to say because AI, it should be the thing that scares everybody. But like you say, there's visible use of AI, there's that kind of thing. And thinking about, I think, your relationship with who is being faked is always a good place to start. Would you expect this kind of communication from them? Does the tone of voice sound right? I'd be very surprised if AI has caught up with that just yet. But also invisible AI, where I see really big success, apart from content generation, which we do plenty of. My team of 3 is spend a lot of time trying to get to grips rather with prompt training as best lawyers can. But how you can use AI to wrangle data that isn't personal but is financial, but then thinking about, what about the platforms that this is uploading onto? What are the terms of that platform? How is it shared with other people? Are you compromising confidentiality without realizing it? There is always going to be a new tool, but that's always been the way as long as technology has been a thing, and certainly since the mid-80s, and certainly in the world of social media. We might all be happy to see the end of X for various different reasons, not least being the tone of that conversation. But you may move to Blue Sky or Mastodon and think that you find there, when, in the words of H.G. Wells, their eyes are already turned against you. I think that's the quote. I've mangled it. I'm going to listen to it in the car on the way to the office.
So I'm really intrigued by this whole area, because there's so much focus on the copyright challenges right now, in terms of training systems, training databases, and source of. And none of that, for obvious reasons, is stated on the database you might take an access to or draw from. And again, that informs the models that we are now using and adopting, even if we take them into small language models or private language models, etc. Where do you feel legislation needs to go to offer more protection around data? And do you see it as a challenge here? Because I see legislation moving really slowly in this space compared to tech.
Well, I mean, we have data protection legislation, and have for decades now. There is a movement towards reform of some of it with the Data Use and Access Bill, and maybe other bits of legislation that will follow. We obviously don't have any regulation of AI. The government's view has been that this is better dealt with by individual regulators, be the ICO, be it Ofcom, be it professional regulators, more often than not, by setting their own standards. And we have a 6-page, as is my understanding, draft members bill, which is almost certainly going to fail because it's not going to have the bipartisan support it would like to, and because we are waiting, I think, to see which way America goes. And given the fact that the head of the Copyright Office has just been fired for pretty much no reason, I think for in due no small part to his views on AI. The EU's legislated against it, has put in a legislative framework that deals with AI deployment to at least some degree. The copyright point is a fascinating one and raises any number of different kinds of ethical issues, and plays into the fact that the UK is still one of the leading exporters of creativity around the world. But equally, I think when you're looking at that debate, it's easy to point at some of the musicians that are quite rightly raising their voices and saying, well, you've made your money. Shouldn't you now be? Are you not standing in the way of innovation? Are you not standing in the way of potentially a different kind of creativity? This is only the first, I think, of many debates that we're going to have about the impacts of AI on wider society and certainly around privacy. The deepfake conversation is a fascinating one, and maybe that's going to be up next. We've seen, ITV reports what our sister firm, Wealth Recovery Solicitors, took part in it's ITV Tonight not that long ago, talking about deepfake scams. They very successfully chased scams around the internet, but this is becoming more and more mainstream. This is not just tech that's used in the movie industry anymore to enhance your enjoyment. It's now being used to take money out of your pocket. And we are going to need to get used to that pretty quickly. But equally, I don't think you can ever divest yourself of your own responsibility to, as I say, just have a moment of pause. I think that's hugely important.
Steve, absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time and coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.